This PowerPoint is from Chapter 12, and it is on defining what social psychology is. The social psychology of this century reveals a major lesson. Often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. And that's a huge part of social psychology, is not looking at the individual by themselves, but looking at them as part of a greater context, as part of a greater society or group of people. Let's further define social psychology a bit. The study of your mind and behavior with other people. Social psychology looks at your personality, interpersonal relationships, and group behavior. Social psychologists focus on how people conceptualize and interpret situations and how these interpretations influence their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Thus, social psychology studies individuals in a social context and how situational variables interact to influence behavior. Let's look at some important concepts that will help us further define the study of social psychology. The first of those concepts is situationism versus dispositionism. Situationism theorizes that our behavior, thoughts, and feelings are determined by our environment. In other words, they are determined by the situation we're in, our environment. Dispositionism theorizes that our behavior, thoughts, and feelings are determined by internal factors. An internal factor is an attribute of a person and includes personality traits and temperament. So essentially, one says behavior, thoughts, and feelings, those core pieces of psychology, are determined by our environment. And the other says no, they're determined by internal factors, just like our personality or our temperament. Most likely it's a combination of both. Most likely our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are determined by both internal qualities and our environment. Let's look at the fundamental attribution error. Remember that we just said that our behavior, emotions, and feelings are likely a result of both internal and external factors. The fundamental attribution error theorizes that we tend to attribute others' behavior solely to internal factors instead of taking into account their situation. So when we look at someone else's behavior, and attribute that to their internal factors, to, oh, well, that's their personality, that's just their temperament, instead of taking into account their situation. For example, if you have a colleague who is always late, you might attribute that to them being lazy and unmotivated and not take into account that they might have personal problems or transportation issues. So let's look a little bit further at that, how we judge others. Again, if you look at the bottom, it says we attribute a person's behavior to their character without taking into account the limitations and constraints within which the person might be operating. In other words, their situation. So the one on the left is saying Anna is unreliable. She can't even attend a meeting on time. And she says Ben is incompetent. He can't finish his projects on time. So they're both assuming that these are internal factors, even when there might be situations that are attributing to these issues. The actor-observer bias. We just saw that the fundamental attribution error theorizes that we often attribute the behavior of others to internal factors. The actor-observer bias, however, theorizes that we often attribute our own behavior to external factors. So, for example, if I'm late for work, I attribute that to heavy traffic or being kept up late by a sick child instead of that I'm just lazy and irresponsible. So it's interesting that we attribute others' behavior to internal factors. That's just who they are. That's their personality. However, when we look at our own behavior, we tend to attribute it to a situation. I was late because of traffic, not because I'm a lazy, unmotivated person. So why do we do this? This could be because we have more information available to explain our own behavior. However, as observers, we have less information available. Therefore, we tend to default to a dispositionist perspective. Or it simply could be that no one likes to look bad, so to protect their self-esteem, we are more likely to blame the situation than take responsibility, which that makes more sense to me, that when it comes to ourselves, we want to just blame the situation. We don't want to take responsibility that it could just be who we are. And when it comes to other people, we're more likely to say, well, that's just who they are. They're just lazy or unmotivated. So kind of an interesting concept. Just this diagram shows that a little bit further. It's saying everyone is responsible for their own behavior except me. I look at myself again as responding to a situation instead of it being an internal attribute. The self-serving bias is the tendency to explain our successes as due to internal characteristics, but to explain our failures as due to external factors. This bias serves to protect self-esteem. You'll notice this is very similar to what we just discussed. We're trying to protect our own self-esteem by attributing our failures to external situations. If people always made situational attributions for their behavior, they would never be able to take credit and feel good about their accomplishments. This is similar, as I mentioned, to one of the likely reasons we commit the actor-observer bias, the previous that we discussed. We're trying to protect our own self-esteem. We want to be able to attribute our successes to ourselves, to internal factors. So self-serving bias, again, is our brain's tendency to take full credit for successes and blame outside forces for failures. An example is, I got the job because of my amazing skills. That's taking success and attributing it to internal processes. Or I didn't get the job because the boss hates me. That's taking a failure and contributing it to external processes. So we tend to do that for some reason, likely to preserve our own self-esteem. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get the outcomes they deserve. In order to maintain the belief that the world is a fair place, people tend to think that good people experience positive outcomes and bad people experience negative outcomes. The ability to think of the world as a fair place where people get what they deserve allows us to feel that the world is predictable and that we have some control over our life outcomes. I think as people, we want to feel like we want to have some control on life and its outcomes. So again, we believe in karma almost, that a bad person gets what they deserve and a good person gets what they deserve. This is called the just world or fair world hypothesis. And a picture of that would be, you deserve it, you killed a fly. So in other words, you deserve to get rained on because you did a bad thing. That's the just world hypothesis. So as usual, thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions. Those are just some ideas behind social psychology. Again, let me know if you have questions. Thank you.